Now, our subject until now was Israel in history and just establishing that the country was there. What you saw was from the 12th century or so on, there's a people there called Israel. There is a people in the south called Judah. And for the rest of the history, we know already there are going to be times when they're united and times when they're not united. They end up eventually completely merging, so today you cannot tell who's descended from a Jew and who's descended from an Israelite from those days. So that wasn't their story, though. Their story was not just we were here, we're kind of always here. Their story was we moved here. First, this family from Mesopotamia, Abraham and his descendants, moved here. So we're not native to this region, we came from somewhere else. And then they said we went away for reasons that we know at the end of the story of Genesis, and then we lived in Egypt for centuries. And that's where we became not just a family wandering around here, but we became a whole nation like we are now. And then, again, we all moved here. Now, those stories are strange in themselves in that if you look at, say, the Middle East today, both Jews and Palestinians say, well, we were always here. Nobody wants to say we're outsiders who came in, because then you're the Europeans, you're not the Indians. Whenever they do that when they use analogies to American history, both sides want to say that they're the Indians, say, because they want to be the indigenous ones. It is unusual for people to make their national history that we moved here from somewhere else. You always want to say, well, we're here because we were here from time immemorial. And yet here's ancient Israel saying, that actually, we moved here. Now, is that true? The part about originally coming from some Mesopotamians is really hard to establish because the stories in Genesis aren't about whole countries. They're movements of individual families. So the chances of getting something archaeologically of something over 3,500 years ago that's just one family moving around, even if they get to be a fairly big clan, the odds against that are 1,000,000 to 1. So it's very hard to get at that. What you would look for are there cultural things in ancient Israel that look like stuff they would have brought with them from Mesopotamia. And for a while they thought they had stuff like that. When the Nuzi tablets were first discovered, they found a case of a guy saying he was adopting his wife as his sister. And everybody goes, oh, it's that story in the Bible where Abraham says his wife is a sister. And they made a big deal of that, because at last they had some kind of piece of Mesopotamian culture in Israel. But then they noticed that it wasn't anything like the story in the Bible, and the adoption was for a different purpose, and it was only one case of one family in one place, and since then it's been repudiated and almost nobody latches onto that one anymore. And so you could see, though, how much we wanted to get something to at least show that this fit with the world of that time. Much more important was the material on the Exodus, because here you would expect, if people spent centuries living in Egypt and then they moved to Israel, they should have all kinds of Egyptian aspects to their culture. Their architecture might look Egyptian, or their pottery, especially you'd look for it, is an Egyptian-style pottery. Their burials, some of the aspects of their religion. You'd look for stuff in their culture that came from Egypt. You'd look for people to have Egyptian names, all of that. So the first question is, what does archaeology not show? The common view in biblical scholarship these days, but especially from archaeological scholarship, is to question the Exodus severely. They say, we've combed the Sinai. We've been looking around there for a long time now, since the archaeological revolution began. And especially since 1967, we've been combing the Sinai, and we haven't found any evidence of a couple million people there in the Sinai, and who would have been there for 40 years. There should be some remnant. And the other half is, in all the archaeology of Israel, the most excavated per square foot country in the world, we haven't found this tons of Egyptian material culture that we should find if that were true and they had all come from there. So we've combed the Sinai. When I lecture on this, I had a big screen, which I don't use for these particular lectures. I had the big photo from the Spaceballs movie of Mel Brooks, where they've combed this planet. And you see they're out in the we've combed the desert, and they've got this giant head comb, and they're combing it. And he says, "What have you got?" They go, "We ain't found shit." So you can keep that. So what is this thing about combing the Sinai? All right, so first of all, that's a lie. We have not combed the Sinai. Nobody has combed the Sinai. There have been very few major excavations in the Sinai. When they say we've combed the Sinai, they're talking about a survey that was done. Now, archaeological surveys are very important, where you do the big, broad study of the region first. It was 5 jeeps. 5 jeeps doth not a combing make. And what is it they think they're going to get? The big conference in my field where all the archaeologists and the Bible scholars and the Hebrew scholars and all of that is this year in San Diego. And at that, I was thinking, beginning my talk with a big announcement saying we've made a great discovery now in the Sinai, the proof that we've all been looking for. It's a piece of petrified wood written by the hand of Moses that says, "Aaron, Mom always liked you better." But see, if I can't get a laugh here with it, I'm sure as heck not going to try it in San Diego. So that's the problem of finding individual items. Second, right, it's only a survey, it's not an excavation. Third, in 1973, in the Israel-Egypt war, there was an Israeli military vehicle was lost in the Sinai. And they found it about 2-3 years ago. 16 meters down in the sand. And you go, wait a minute, that's 50 feet, right? This thing was 1973, and it's already under 16 meters of sand. And we're talking about things that are supposed to have happened 3,300 years ago. How many meters is that down? But still, I'm prepared to admit that if we're really talking about a couple million people for 40 years, we should have found something. So the problem is finding, 2 million people that many of us would say, all right, but that should have produced something still that we would have found in this time. My colleague, Professor Levy, who visited us this week, while he was excavating in the southern part of Israel, the Negev, at the site of Shikmim, he uncovered an Egyptian tomb. An Egyptian tomb in Israel. And it was from the pre-dynastic period of Egypt. So we're talking early, before there's any pharaohs. Some powerful Egyptian, a rich guy, soldier, something, for some reason, is in the Israel region, and he dies, and they build him a big, fancy, beautiful tomb with a long ramp leading down into it and all. So we do uncover old things. But okay, 2 million is a lot to ask for. But we knew that anyway. When the archaeologists among my colleagues say, well, we've combed the Sinai and we haven't found anything, that doesn't prove there wasn't an exodus. At most, that questions the numbers in the story in the Bible. Right? It says 603,550 adult males, from which, depending who you're talking to, you derive 1.5 million, 2 million, 3 million people, depending on how many kids you think each guy had and so on. It was calculated if they were marching 8 across, that many people, then when the first ones got to Mount Sinai, half of them were still in Egypt. Now you could say, okay, so they marched 16 across. They marched 100 across. Still, the point of that was the numbers don't really work well with the space. You can fit that many people into the Sinai, yes, but that many people on the move, all their animals, everything. And I think it was Bishop Colenso in South Africa, who was one of the early Church of England Bible critics. He calculated the amount of, what's a nice word for it? Residue that many people would have produced in 40 years. And he calculated that the Sinai should be fertile. So we never needed to insist on the numbers. Now, if you're a literalist about the Bible and you believe every word of the Bible is true, then yes, the numbers matter to you. Critical Bible scholarship never involved in insisting on the individual numbers. But we'll actually look into that. So many people, though, who are willing to give up on those numbers and all, will then say, okay, a second sort of backing up somewhat position is the Exodus may have happened, but not in the time and manner in the text. You get this in Israel Finkelstein and Neil Silberman's book, The Bible Unearthed. I was involved in the television version of that book. The problem is it was done for European television. A crew came over from France, and they took over my house for 2 days and filmed me interviewing them and took photographs of me driving along in a car with Israel Finkelstein talking about the Bible and archaeology and hugging each other and all. And then he left and went to LA, and they stayed in my house for 2 days and filmed me. And we did 2 days of interviews, and then they took it back to Europe, where you may know European television is much advanced over American in dubbing. They don't use a lot of subtitles. They put movies into the language there. And even in dramatic films, there's like the certain guy will always be the voice of Al Pacino. So all the Al Pacino movies will sound the same. But in France, it's always the same French guy does Al Pacino. And in Germany, it's always the same German guy who does Al Pacino, and so on. They do all that. And they do it for documentaries as well. So I was going to be talking English, and Deutsch was going to be coming out from my mouth when they showed it in Germany, and Français was going to come out from my bouche in Paris. Hopefully with someone with a better accent than I just did. And when they brought it back to Europe, the French producers didn't like it. They thought it should be a French scholar, not an American scholar. So I was completely cut out after 2 days in my house. But I got to keep the money, so I became a Bible scholar for the money. As Bogart said in Casablanca, Irish mission formed, So Finkelstein and Silberman, remember them? They said, and others have done this too, they said, okay, the Exodus may have happened, but not in the time and the manner that it's described in the text. Oh my God, thank God they cleared that up for us. That there may have been an Exodus, but maybe the sun didn't get blacked out for 3 days, which is good news because I'm not really an expert in astrophysics, but I think if there was some situation that caused the sun to be darkened for 3 days, the Earth wouldn't exist anymore. So I'm pretty happy about that. That maybe the sticks didn't turn into snakes. So saying the Exodus may have happened, but not exactly as described in the text. Okay. I mean, this is what's known as archaeological confirmation of the obvious. But you go to this position saying, but maybe there was an Exodus. But was it 2 million people? The part about the miracles, that's always been a matter of faith, not a matter of something you'd confirm with archaeology and logic anyway. So let's look at the numbers. Now, you all know that the oldest source we have on the Exodus is the Song of the Sea. And what, according to the Song of the Sea, is the number of Israelites who went out of Egypt? Answer, it doesn't say. It doesn't give any numbers. That's our oldest poetic source. What's our second oldest source on the Exodus? There's a prose source, and it's the text known as J, running neck and neck with E for what's the oldest. And the oldest prose source, J, which is presumably the oldest prose writing at all on Earth, east or west, anywhere. There is no prose writing on Earth prior to J. If you think J is history, then it's the oldest history writing on Earth. If you think it's fiction, then it's the oldest novel on Earth. But whatever you think it is, it's the first one of those. And what are the numbers who leave Egypt according to the text of J? Answer, no, it doesn't give the numbers. So our two sources that are the closest we can get to the event are not concerned with numbers and don't give any numbers. It is the fourth source we have, the priestly source, that gives the 603,550. Now, you know that in my reading of it, the priestly source is from the time of Hezekiah, that's around 700 BCE, which is to say it's 500 or 600 years after the Exodus. So where did they get such a precise number as 603,550 at that point? So that's of some suspicion. That is to say, the numbers were not an original issue in the story, and our sources on the numbers are not good because they come much later than the sources that were close to it. So what can we get from these early sources? Here's what we got. When they held a conference in San Diego a couple years back, I gave a presentation on it, which is among your assigned material to look at. And you'd have to listen to all of the 20-something papers that were given at that conference to get the broad picture, because it was geologists, archaeologists, historians, Egyptologists, biblical scholars. It was everything. 20-something papers, and you were supposed to be there for all of them. Okay, I skipped some. Mothers, don't let your children grow up to be scholars. 3 days of paper after paper after paper. But what did come out of a lot of them is practically everybody recognized that there were people from Western Asia, Asia Minor, call them Semites, Western Asiatics, who were living in Egypt. They're everything from the lower classes, like the Apiru or Shasu, to the highest classes, the Hyksos dynasty, if they're from that region. But there are people, Western Asiatic, Semitic type people, living in Egypt for about 4 centuries, which is interesting because 4 centuries is what the Bible claims was the period of settlement in Egypt. But I wouldn't fight about that. Those numbers could be coincidental anyway. But for several centuries, there's a large number of people from Western Asia who make the trip, which you know isn't that long a trip, down to Egypt and live there. And they're coming and going for centuries. It's not illegal to cross the border and come or go from Egypt. They're just not doing it in groups of millions at a time. So was there an exodus? There were, what's the plural of exodus? Exoditos, right? Muchos exoditos. I'm not making fun, I swear. I can't make fun of Mexican Spanish because my birthday is Cinco de Mayo, you see? So I've got to be okay. When I first moved to San Diego, being an Easterner, I didn't know about Cinco de Mayo, that it was a holiday. And I walked out onto the campus of the university, and there was everybody doing all these wonderful celebrations and having all this great food out and all. And I'm going, well, you know, this is like my first year here. They're celebrating. I later learned, you know, Battle of Pueblo, is that it? It's an event. Good day to go to a Mexican restaurant, and I get to use the only Spanish that I know, which is una cerveza, por favor. No, I also know dos margaritas, por favor, and tres margaritas, por favor, and dos pitchers of margaritas, por favor. You're not supposed to kid around about joking in lecture. It's like you're encouraging your students to drink. So I want you all to drink responsibly, only of age. Do not drive if you drink, and so on. Now, our oldest sources in prose are this J source and E source. What do they tell? You studied the issues of the authorship of the Bible and learned that the first clue, and probably to this day, the most famous clue about the authorship of the Bible is about the name of God. And it's also the most frequently misquoted and misunderstood clue. People say it's an issue of, quote, the names of God. And it's that God has more than one name, and in one source it's the name Yahweh, and in the other source it's the name El or Elohim. And so wherever you see Yahweh, it's that source, J. Whenever you see the other name, it's that source, E, or it turns out P. That's wrong. And people use that to refute the hypothesis because they say, well, look, Leviticus is supposed to be the priestly source, but the name Yahweh occurs all over the place, so that should be J. Or they'll say Bible scholars are just you're making it up as you go. Wherever you see the name of God, you say that's the J source. Whenever you don't see it, you see this E, Elohim, say, that's the E source. Then you go, look, it works. It's consistent with the right name and the right source. That's really not how it works at all. And the issue is not that God has different names and different sources. God's name is Yahweh. The issue is that there are these two sources, E and P, that have a different idea of when God's name was revealed. That's the difference. In E, God's name is not known to the world until Moses at the burning bush. That's why Moses at the burning bush says to God, when I go to the children of Israel and I say, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, they're going to say, what's his name? What shall I tell them? And you're going like, why would they not know his name? Why do they not know their own God's name? And God reveals it to him. He says, my name is Yahweh, that is my name, that is my mention, my recollection for all generations. That's an E source. In the priestly source, it's explicit in Exodus 6:3. God says, I am Yahweh, but to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I was not known by my name Yahweh, I was known as El Shaddai. So in both the E source and the P source, it's understood that God's name used to be El, which can be a name or can just be the generic word God, or else Elohim, which is just a generic, it's not a proper name, it's just the word God. And then if you look back before Exodus 3 and E, and before Exodus 6 and P, you go through all of Genesis and those first chapters of Exodus, sure enough, in the E source, God will always be El or Elohim. And most explicitly in Genesis 17, in the priestly version of the covenant between God and Abraham, the opening words are misunderstood by people in this respect. It's the P source, but the word Yahweh actually does occur there. And they say, ha, we cut you guys, your theory is wrong. But it's not the exception, it's the exception that proves the rule. The first verse of Genesis 17 was, Abraham was 99 years old, and Yahweh appeared to him and said to him, I am El Shaddai. Right? The narrator is saying it was Yahweh who appeared to Abraham, and he didn't say, I am Yahweh. He said, I am El Shaddai. And that's utterly consistent with what God says in Exodus 6:3, where he says, I wasn't known by my name, Yahweh, to your ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I was known as El Shaddai. Then there's another little piece of this as well. There's this J source, which doesn't have any of that. In the J source, God is just called Yahweh all the way. Depending on your reading, it starts with Eve is the first person to say the name Yahweh, except in the Greek, it's not Yahweh there. It's Greek theos, which means they're reading Elohim, not Yahweh. And in which case, the first person to say the name of God would be Lamech in J. But that's to say, it's known from the earliest generations of human beings. And then it's Yahweh all the way through. And interestingly, characters in the story in J, the persons, will refer to God as God, Elohim, but the narrator never does. The narrator always refers to God by his name as Yahweh. Okay, so you got this? E and P, God is El or Elohim until Moses, and then his name is known as Yahweh, and then they could use either word. J, God is known as Yahweh from beginning to end, without an exception. Did you want to ask something?
I was curious, in the Greek, does it differentiate between Elohim, El, or Yahweh, as using the word theos?
Elohim is always theos. Yahweh is always Greek Kyrie, which means Lord. I can't remember if on El or Elohim they're distinguishing. I think they use theos for both, but I would check that to be sure for you. Now, there are a couple of times where it's different in the Greek. And you'd understand that. If you were translating the whole Bible, let's say the whole Torah, from Hebrew into English, with all those occurrences of Yahweh, El, and Elohim, you might once slip and write English Lord when you should have written God, or vice versa. And in fact, in the Greek, there are a few, not a lot, but there are a few cases where you get the wrong name in the wrong place. But you'd understand that in a translation. So what you really want to check is the Dead Sea Scrolls, because Dead Sea Scrolls are in Hebrew. Nobody's translating it. It's another Hebrew manuscript that's even older than the Hebrew manuscript that we're all working with here. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it is almost identical to this Masoretic text, remarkably consistent. There are only two cases where it has, Yahweh or Elohim here, and it has the reverse word in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as it happens, those are two cases where the name is revealed already, so it doesn't change anything in the story anyway. So the evidence is 100% consistent between those. So how consistent is this altogether in itself? There are 2,000 occurrences of Yahweh, El, or Elohim in the Torah. And of the 2,000, there are 3 exceptions. There are 3 verses where you get the wrong word in the wrong place for the hypothesis. 3 out of 2,000 is pretty good. On a manuscript that was copied by hand, after all, for millennia. So the name thing is very powerful evidence. But my question for now isn't just, what is this name thing, and is this good evidence of different authors of the Torah? The question is, why would anybody do that? Why would 2 out of 3 of the main authors of the first books of the Bible have this idea that we didn't know God's name until the generation of Moses and Aaron? Why didn't they make it Noah? Why do they even go into that at all? Why don't they God's name is Yahweh, why didn't they just tell the story? Yahweh, 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 the way Jay does. So there's a reason why they do it. Now, what is it that E and P have in common that J does not? Answer: E and P are written by Levites. They're both priestly sources. So is D. So E, P, and D are produced by the community known as Levites. There are different groups within that community. We talk about Aaronids, the ones who trace their descent from Aaron. We talk about Mushites or Shilonites or the Danite priesthood. There were different clans of priests, but they're all Levites. So let's put these facts together. There are people from Western Asia living in Egypt. They're not the whole country of the Israelites. The Israelites are in Israel the whole time. But there are some who are living in Egypt. And those who leave the Egypt, one of the groups of people who leave Egypt in this period, what if they're the Levites? And that was the hypothesis. You'll find it in Who Wrote the Bible, where I put it in just one paragraph, and I said it was a possibility, but I didn't push it any further than that. But that was in 1987, and now we're in 2014. And a lot changes from 87 to 2014. We know much more now archaeologically and biblically, and I've had more time to think about it. So let's start with the hypothesis that there was an Exodus, but it was just the Levites. Now you're rid of all these arguments about how many people there were in the wilderness. It could have been 100 Levites, it could have been 1,000, but it wasn't 2 million. It wasn't any kind of number that would leave any remnant in the Sinai. Now, what further evidence could we find of this? The Song of Deborah. All right, our two oldest things were the Song of Miriam and the Song of Deborah. The Song of Miriam, as I said, does not give any numbers of the people going out. The other thing the Song of Miriam doesn't do is it never mentions the word Israel. It just refers to a people going out of Egypt. And it's the Hebrew word an am, which is a people. And it says where they came to, and we'll see where they come to. But it's like to God's holy mountain, his sacred place. They only make it pretty much as far as the temple. No description of them coming and arriving in the whole land. And they're not defined or described as all of Israel. What's going on in the Song of Deborah, meanwhile? In the Song of Deborah, you remember, Deborah was pictured as the mother of Israel, and the battle that she and the Israelites fight against the Canaanites is the defining battle that established Israelite hegemony in the region. They're defeating Hatzor, and archaeologically, there was a great destruction of Hatzor in that period. And in the Song of Deborah, read it over again. She summons the tribes. Now, she does not summon Judah, because remember, Judah with Simeon in it is a separate country down south. But in the north, the country of Israel, there are 10 tribes, and she calls the tribes of Israel, except one doesn't get mentioned. She never summons the Levites. Now, why does the Song of Deborah not include the Levites? Possibility A, because they were in Egypt at the time, or on the road, on the wilderness journey back. Possibility B, you might say, is the more banal solution and therefore the more likely one, which is they're the priests of Israel, so she's not summoning them because they're not like the other tribes of Israel. They're a priestly group functioning. They're a professional group, not a tribal group originally. And I, too, would admit that would be the simpler, more likely explanation than that it's just the Levites who are down in Egypt. Except there's other factors in this. One, Levites have Egyptian names. The name Hophni, two guys named Phinehas, Hur, Merari, Mushi, and above all, the most famous we've discussed, Moses. The guys with Egyptian names are all Levites, whereas none of the names biblically of the northern Israelites are undeniably Egyptian. There's one Hur down in Judah, but they're not in the story yet. Hur is, it's a Greek Horus, it's a god. Now, we've talked about names before here because in North America especially, a land of immigrants and all that, a great percentage of people, if they tell you their first and last name, you can figure out from what country their family came. Not all, that wouldn't work for all of us, but you can think in your own head if Friedman, Austro-Hungarian Jew, 95% of the time in America. It's just the way it is. If your name is Shaughnessy, the odds are very low of being an Austro-Hungarian Jew who came to America. See, now I've insulted Irish also. I'm going to try to get everybody. For years I used the joke, Jewish coffee, Irish coffee, but nobody ever laughed at it. Anyway, names are an important cultural piece of evidence. Second, what is the most commonly discussed thing in the Torah of Moses? Answer, the tabernacle. The tabernacle got all those chapters with all the cubits. I know you all read it really carefully, with the measurements and the fabrics and the colors, and then everything important takes place at the tabernacle. It's crucial to the story. There's more about the tabernacle than about anything else in the Torah. And it's all in the Levite sources. The J source that's not traced to being by a Levite, it doesn't get into the tabernacle at all. It doesn't mention it. Whereas in E, it's a lot, and in P, it's a real lot. It's everywhere. And it was my student, Michael Homan, who's now, for quite some time now, a professor at Xavier in New Orleans, who did as his doctoral dissertation a study of tents. And it's a book you can read. It's called To Thy Tents, O Israel. He published his dissertation as a book. And he studied how that all worked. Homan is interested in like the real life of the biblical world. So that was a whole book just on tents. His next book was on what people ate and especially what they drank in the biblical world. Like he was interested in like their liquor, he like puts flesh and bones on the biblical story. And by the way, it's wine and beer. They didn't have hard liquor in the ancient Near East. A world without Jack Daniels? A world without single malts? I know it's hard to believe, but there you are. But they had wine and beer. And in his work on tents in the ancient Near East, he looked at the picture of the tabernacle as we identify it, especially in Exodus 25 and forward to the end of Exodus. And the way it's set up, remember, there's the tabernacle in the middle, and it's got the shrine inside it with the ark, and then around it, it's got this courtyard with these marking things like a giant gate with curtains and all around it and all. And he found that looks stunningly like the arrangement of the battle tent of Pharaoh Ramses II, who is the right pharaoh at the right time. And you can just Google that, do Pharaoh Ramses II tent, or battle tent Ramses II, and just bring up photographs of we've got their drawings of it, and it's the same arrangement. So when you say, are there any remnants in the material culture of ancient Israel that reflect experience of ancient Egypt? Well, now we've got one. But it's not that all of Israel has it. It's only the Levites who have it. Yeah.
What do you make of the tabernacle or tent found at Timnah?
I don't know.
Holman argues that it's one of the closest parallels we have to the actual tabernacle.
Look, if they stopped in Timnah on the way, I'm thrilled. And if that's a connection, that's great. But for the moment, if I got it in Egypt and in Israel, I'm happy.
Sure. We have Egyptians and Midianites at Timnah.
At Timnah, so it works fine. Likewise, at that San Diego conference, there was a paper by Scott Nogel, who's a professor at U of Washington and UW. There are 3 universities in America with Washington, and everybody confuses which is the St. Louis one and the DC one, and the one in the state of Washington, UW. And he presented because I'm prejudiced against the Northwest too. See, well, I am because it rains a lot there. I don't dig rain. He presented a paper about Egyptian barks. And his paper was about the Ark and the bark. Now, a bark is a kind of boat. And the Egyptians had these barks. But the ones he showed, though they were boats, they never went in the water. They were carried by men on their shoulders on 2 long sticks. And they had winged things like cherubs or birds on the top of them over gold shrines. And he goes on and on about all the parallels between that and the Ark in the Bible. And he said that he was persuaded that there is no doubt, he concluded that the Ark of the Israelites is in some way related to the ceremonies of the Egyptian barks. But again, the Ark is strictly a Levite thing. Or if you read the story of the plagues in Egypt as told in the different sources of the Bible, the E source has one set of stories about the plagues. The priestly source has a different one. The priestly source is the one that has always with the magicians trying to do the tricks too, and so on. And the J source has nothing. The J source has Moses walking up to Pharaoh and saying, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh saying, "I don't know Yahweh, and I will not let your people go." And then it has they're leaving Egypt and they're on their way to the Red Sea. Now, it could be that the editor just didn't like the J version that much, or it was too similar to the E version, or it could be J didn't have a plague story. I don't know. All I know is that all we've got from the evidence is an E and a P story of the whole dynamic that took place in Egypt between Moses and Pharaoh, and not a J story. It is the Levite sources that tell that story. It is the Levite source P that emphasizes circumcision. The mark of the Abrahamic covenant in P is circumcision from then until this day. In the J story of the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 15, circumcision isn't mentioned. In P, circumcision is used as a metaphor, and so in the other Levite sources. So in the book of Leviticus and in the book of Deuteronomy. So those are 2 different Levitical groups, the priestly group and the Deuteronomistic, whoever that is, Mushite, Shilonite, whatever priestly group. They both have the term circumcise your heart. The prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel both use the expression to circumcise your heart. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are the 2 prophets who are also priests. They're Levites. In Exodus, in a priestly text in Exodus 6, it says, circumcise your, Moses talks about being of uncircumcised lips. Jeremiah says to the people, you should circumcise your ears, meaning, cut away what's blocking your ears from hearing God, is the metaphor. But that is to say, both literally and metaphorically, you've got 4 different Levite sources, right? D and P and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, all using references to circumcision. That's 11 references, all in Levite texts. Now, what do you have in the J text? You have, sorry?
Exodus 4:26.
Yes, that's where I'm coming to. What about in the J text? What stories do you have about circumcision? You got 2. One of them is in that story that when Moses and his wife and kid are on their way to Egypt, and there's this weird story in Exodus 4 that nobody knows what it means for sure. I mean, besides me, where God is angry at Moses, and he has Moses in some kind of grip, or Moses has some kind of disease, or something is happening, and you're not sure what. And Zipporah circumcises Moses' son, and touches the bloody foreskin. It says to his feet, which can mean the son's feet, Moses' feet, or God's feet. And she says, you are a bridegroom of blood to me, which can mean any one of 10 different things anthropologically. And then he lets go of him. And you go, who let go of whom? And it begins with it saying, he sought to kill him, which people have always taken to mean God sought to kill Moses. And you go, why does he want to kill him after he went to all this trouble to get him to go there? And I suggested that it meant the reverse. The Hebrew can mean he asked to kill him, which Moses does 2 other times in the story too. That is, Moses was asking God to kill him rather than make him go to Egypt. But whatever is going on in that story in J, it is not the story of why Israelites are supposed to circumcise themselves. It's this one weird story. And the only piece I'd add to that is it takes place in a Levite family. And the other place where circumcision is mentioned in J is where? In Genesis. Where's the story of circumcision? Genesis 34. The story of Dinah. Remember, Dinah and Shechem have some sort of sexual relationship that her brothers don't approve of. Some people think it's a rape, some think it's a seduction. Whatever it is, they do not approve of how their sister has been treated. And so they trick the people of the city of Shechem into getting circumcised. And then when they're all weakened from, it's like the day after the circumcision, 2 of her brothers come in and they massacre the city. Now again, this is not a story of why we circumcise ourselves. But what's interesting is who are the 2 brothers? It's Simeon and Levi. So even in the J source, which isn't a Levite source, the 2 stories it has that have anything to do with circumcision both involve Levites. All right, so you have all of that. So for all of those who say, if there were an experience in Egypt, why aren't there signs of Egyptian cultural connections? There are. There's the circumcision, there's the ark, there's the tabernacle, there's the Egyptian names. There's all of that, but only in Levite sources, which goes together with the hypothesis that maybe it was the Levites who had the experience of leaving Egypt. Yeah?
I'm not sure if you're getting to this, but roughly what time did you say if the texts of Deborah and that are here and the Levites were here and Israel was actually there with the judges? It was just the Levites that came up. What time did you have it be?
Well, the nice thing about it being the Levites is you're not narrowed as much as you are on any other hypothesis. In the usual discussion of this, it begins with Pharaoh Merneptah. You remember I've mentioned to you that the earliest reference to Israel is the stela of Pharaoh Merneptah, who's right after Ramses II. Merneptah says, remember, that Israel's seed is no more. It was a period where Israel, that is to say, was very powerful in the region where Israel is. And he refers, though, to Israel as a people living there in the land. So everybody says, if there was an Exodus, it had to be prior to him. That's one of the reasons why in the movies they always make it Ramses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. But if it's a smaller group, if it's just the Levites, and the Israelites are in the land the whole time, then the exodus of these Levites could have taken place prior to Merneptah, or could have taken place after Merneptah. Now people say in this period, as it happens, Egypt controlled the Sinai. Its military was there. And therefore you couldn't have had these couple million Israelites making their way for 40 years roaming around the Sinai, because they couldn't do that without bumping into Egyptian military forces. And I go, again, right, that's true if you're talking about 2 million people. It's not true if you're just talking about a smaller group. So the dates become much more flexible if you're not looking for all of Israel being in the Sinai. Which again eliminates the standard arguments against the Exodus. Now there's another thing that's common in the Levite sources. In the E source, in the law code, it says don't oppress an alien. Now, the word for an alien in Hebrew is a ger. Ger is translated in the King James as stranger. So in a lot of your English Bibles, whatever they are, even if it's not King James, the most common translation you'll see is the word stranger. So understand when you see the word stranger, it is almost always referring to the Hebrew word ger. It means, an outsider, a foreigner, someone who's not a member of a group. In post-biblical times, it came to mean a convert to Judaism. So sometimes a religious Jew will read the Torah, and whenever they see the word ger, they think it's talking about people converting to Judaism. But that's not correct. In the Bible, nobody converts to Judaism. There is not a single case of conversion, and don't tell me Ruth. Women automatically take the religion of their husbands. That's just done. They don't have to do some conversion ceremony or anything, and it's never once described that way. And never once does a man go out. If a man worships pagan gods, he's supposed to get killed for that. And in any event, he doesn't cease to be an Israelite or a Jew because he bowed down to a Baal statue. So it means a resident alien. And the law there is, you shouldn't treat a resident alien different from a citizen. It's a crucial thing. The first occurrence of the word Torah in the Torah is in Exodus 12, and the verse says, you shall have one Torah for the citizen and for the alien. Now that's tremendous. That is not American law. If any of you have had business with the INS, you know what I'm talking about. If you're a resident, a visitor here from Canada or Mexico or any place, you do not have the same legal protections in some matters that an American citizen has. And I'm not making some, I know immigration is a big issue just this very week, and I'm not trying to go there at all. I'm only talking about the situation as it's always been, that it happens in American law. There are protections for aliens, but they do not have equal protections with American citizens. Whereas biblically, it's a different principle. I'm not even arguing who's better. I'm just telling you there are two different legal systems here. In the biblical legal system, an alien has exactly the same rights as a native Israelite. So if you are a Greek or an Aramaean or a Persian or whatever on vacation in Israel in biblical times, and you get into legal trouble, you're supposed to have the exact same protections as somebody who was born there. And I said it's mentioned the first time that the word Torah comes up. Altogether, it's mentioned 52 times. You may have noticed when you were reading through all those laws in the Bible, every now and then it would say, you and the alien who lives among you, or the stranger who lives among you. You counted, I counted. There's 52 of them, like in a deck of cards. Could that be coincidence? I think not. And they had kings, just like in a deck of cards. And there were definitely some jokers in ancient Israel. But, that would go over 52, wouldn't it? That ruined that point. It wasn't that funny anyway. It wasn't worth it. So 52 different times when it mentions a law, it says, oh, and by the way, it's the same law for an alien. And why? Why should they have a rule that says you can't treat an alien differently from a citizen? And it tells you why. It says, because you were aliens in Egypt. You know how it feels. So it says, don't oppress an alien. It says you can't bend the judgment of an alien, meaning if an alien is in your courts, you can't favor the citizen against him in a trial. It is absolutely this crucial point that an alien is the same because we were. And indeed, the word ger is the standard word for alien, but Professor Propp, who wrote the best Exodus commentary, the Anchor Bible Exodus commentary, he argued that there's another word in Hebrew that means alien as well. And it's the word, no one is sure exactly what the word Levi, Hebrew Levi, where it came from or what it originally meant. It can mean, it's related as a verb, mean to lend something to somebody else. And Propp made the case that the likely meaning of Levi is an attached person, like a resident, someone from the outside who becomes attached to your community, in which case the word Levi, they may be called that because that's what they were in Egypt. They were not Egyptians. They were people from outside who became attached. They were resident aliens in Egypt. Or it could mean that it's them who, when they came to Israel, they weren't like the native tribes of Israel, but they became connected and attached themselves as the priests of Israel. And that's what Levi means. So that the original word in Hebrew, Levi, in the earliest text, a Levi means a priest. But in the sense that they could be an outside community who joined up, yeah.
Can it just be an attached person to a sanctuary rather than an attached person to
Oh,
a community?
that's terrific.
In Manayan in Northwest Arabia, you have a term that's very, very similar to that. That means someone who's attached to a shrine as a priest. So,
I like that and don't like it. What I like, it makes so much sense. It's lovely that a person becomes attached that way to the shrines. And the reason why I hesitate only is through the Deuteronomic law code in the earliest stages of it, most of the Levites are not attached to a shrine. They're dispersed around the country. Though that still wouldn't necessarily mean that this is wrong, because their original meaning could have been they started out attached to a sanctuary. But that's what let's say I'm cautious about it, but it makes a lot of sense. And it's a third option that I don't think Propp suggested.
yeah.
So publish it. Quick. Claim it. That's what I used to think. So I used to publish things to claim them, and then people they still stole from me. So they say that imitation is the highest form of compliment, but I've learned that in scholarship, theft is the highest form of compliment. You stole that from me. Oh, I guess you thought it was pretty good. The Song of Miriam refers to God 9 times, always as Yahweh, never as El or Elohim. Never refers to Israel, only to the Am. Doesn't lead them to the whole land. Rather, it says God plants this Am in his legacy's mountain, at his Mikdash, his sanctuary, where his throne's platform is. And that term, the throne's platform, only occurs in one other place, and it's in Solomon's temple address in 1 Kings 8 of the establishment of the temple. So we have this, that the Song of Deborah, which is set in Israel, doesn't mention the Levites, and the Song of Miriam, which is set in Egypt, doesn't mention all of Israel. So you put all of this together, and it's a case of the following scenario. The Levites were in Egypt. They left in the 13th or 12th century. They came to worship a god named Yahweh. How they came to Yahweh, I don't know. It could have been with them already in Egypt, or it could be their encounter with Midianites, as the text itself presents it. They come to the land, and there they become connected with Israelite tribes. Why? It could be because there was kinship, because they were Semitic originally too. Or it could be not kinship, but because the Israelite tribes recently, under Deborah and all, had conquered the region. Now they were the guys in charge. So you united with the Israelites because the Israelites were, where the action was. But now where are they going to live? The Israelites have tribal territories. You have all looked, and there's maps, and you see where the different tribes were. Well, they've all got land, and now these Levites show up. And they say, okay, give us some land. And the Israelites say, okay, you can have some of Issachar. And Issachar says, ho, ho. You give them some of Ephraim. Ephraim says, oh, we're not giving them any. That's our land. So no, countries don't just give up pieces of their land, and tribes don't either. So they're not offering any land to these new Levites who've arrived. Now, how do the Levites react to that? You do not mess with Levites. There are 4 different stories in the Bible where Levites are violent people. One was the one I mentioned, the story of Shechem and Dinah in Genesis 34, where Levi is one of the 2 brothers who massacre everybody. One is Jacob's deathbed blessing in Genesis 49, where he refers to Levi and Simeon as violence and refers to their weapons and says, therefore, they should be scattered in Israel, which may or may not refer to the same thing as is being referred to in Genesis 34, the Dinah story. At the golden calf story, Moses has the Levites massacre people who were associated with the golden calf. And in the blessing of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, which is also one of probably the 5 oldest things in the Bible, it says, where Moses goes through each of the tribes of Israel, when he gets to Levi, he says, pierce Levi's adversaries' hips and those who hate him so they won't get up. You don't mess with Levites. And the 4 examples I just gave you are from 4 different authors, right? That was J and E and the Genesis 49 blessing, which is by somebody else, and the blessing of Moses in Deuteronomy 33, which is by somebody else. That is 4 different authors of the Bible associated Levi with violence. If the Levites want land and you don't give it to them, you find a horse head in your bed the next morning. So they make a deal. The Levites don't get territory, but they get a few cities, like Hebron is a Levite city, and they get a tithe, 10%. Everybody pays the Levites 10%, and that's done in their role as priests. You bring a sacrifice, you're going to eat the animal, but not 10% of the animal. That goes to the Levites. Now that's pretty good now that they've made this deal. They're the priests of Israel, so they can live all around Israel. They get some cities where they can cluster if they want, or else they're like these ones we mentioned in Deuteronomy who are like the countryside Levites. They end up at the big sanctuaries like the temple in Jerusalem, also at the Arad sanctuary where, remember, there are sons of Korach there. But the Levites are not just priests. They are identified as teachers. They're associated with the Hebrew word yara. That root meaning is the same as the meaning of the word Torah. They're teachers. And it says explicitly, it's in Deuteronomy 33:10, you can look at the verse, and in Leviticus 10:11. So both in a priestly text and in a Deuteronomistic text, it is identified that Levites' job is to teach everything to the people. And they taught the Exodus to everyone. And as the teachers of Israel, teachers can be very influential. Not anymore. But in those days, teachers could be really influential. And so now all the Sunday school teachers in Israel, right, all the priests, are teaching the kids from the time they're small and teaching the people to teach their kids. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and now we're free. So in Exodus 13:14 it says, and it will be when your child will ask you tomorrow, saying, what is this? That you'll say to him, with strength of hand, Yahweh brought us out from Egypt, from a house of slaves. In Deuteronomy 6 it says, when your child will ask you tomorrow, saying, what are the testimonies and the laws and the judgments that Yahweh our God commanded you? You shall say to your child, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, and Yahweh brought us out from Egypt with a strong hand, and Yahweh put great and harsh signs and wonders in Egypt and at Pharaoh and at all of his household before our eyes, and he brought us out from there in order to bring us, to give us the land that he swore to our fathers. In Deuteronomy 26, which is thought to be one of the oldest prose passages in the Torah, there is this formula you're supposed to say when you bring your gift, your tithing, to the Levites, and here's what you say. My father was a perishing Aramaean. Remember, Abraham comes from Haran, which is in Aram. So he went to Egypt and resided there with few persons and became a big, powerful, and numerous nations there. And the Egyptians were bad to us and degraded us and imposed hard work on us. And we cried out to Yahweh, our fathers' God, and Yahweh listened to our voice and saw our degradation and our trouble and our oppression. And Yahweh brought us out from Egypt with a strong hand and an outstretched arm and with great fear and with signs and with wonders. And he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now here I've brought the first fruit of the land that you've given me, Yahweh. And if those aren't enough examples, there's the 10 Commandments, which don't begin with the first command, which is to have, only worship the one God. The opening words of the 10 Commandments are, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt, from a house of slaves. Now, how many generations would it take? This week is Thanksgiving. The great majority of us in this room are going to go celebrate this event in which we have no historical stake at all. How many of us are descended either from the Wampanoag or from the Pilgrims? I'm making a turkey anyway, and I'll sing, the songs and, Yeah. Americans, not all, but disproportionately, Americans accept Thanksgiving even if they have no connection historically to the original Thanksgiving event. Well, that's Tinker Toys compared to the Egypt story, where you've got all the priests in the country teaching everybody. So what would it take? 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, 5 generations, whatever number it takes. There's a point where everybody grows up with the story. And they say, we were slaves in Egypt. Now that has 2 corollaries. Number 1, if we were all slaves in Egypt and all the Israelites are learning that, that means there had to be a lot bigger exodus. It couldn't have been just them Levites. And so you start getting in the E source, it starts saying, oh yeah, we became very big and strong in Egypt, and finally it says we became 600,000. And then 100, 200 years later, the priestly source says 603,550 adult males, as a matter of fact. And then we get all these numbers, and then you get modern archaeologists saying, we combed the Sinai, we couldn't find no 603,550 adult male remnants. And then they say, therefore, that it didn't happen. But no, that was a corollary they had to make. And the other thing is, I've told you that the evidence is that the conquest, what's told in the book of Joshua, didn't happen. That was a corollary too. If Israel started to accept the idea that we were all in Egypt, and then we came here, then there had to be a conquest when we first got here. There had to have been like people here, Canaanites, and we beat them. So they make up that story. So some people have said the evidence against the conquest is also evidence against the Exodus. It's not. You can have an Exodus, and that's why you needed to tell a story about a conquest, even though there's no evidence of it. So the consequences of this are just tremendous. We will examine them theologically and what all of this means for the origin of monotheism next time.